we get wrapped up in that word soul, maybe, when we say that like plants have a soul or animals have a soul or something like that. But what they mean by soul is not what we understand. Like, we're thinking of it through this post-Descartes dualism that a soul is like this human immaterial thing or whatever. This is a word they use to distinguish a living thing versus a non-living thing. Just to slap a little bit of Bible on it as well, the Bible also often calls animals as having a soul, using the same word that the Old Testament used, nephesh, to refer to a human soul.
Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble. Today we're going to talk about OpenAI. We're going to talk about AI. We're going to talk about machines, and they are making claims about what it means to be human. They are making claims about building artificial general intelligence that is smarter than humanity. They're making claims about we have the same intelligence as a PhD student. They are making claims that this is not just computing, but it's thinking. Right, Joel? Like, that's kind of the language that they are using.
They do use the term thinking in the latest one, yeah.
Yeah. So they're saying we've leveled up. Now, they make these metaphysical claims that we need to dissect. And I'm serious about this. These are metaphysical claims. Is AI something? Is it a thinking thing? Is it actually thinking, or is it just processing? And is there a difference between the two? Does AI have a mind? These kinds of questions are metaphysical questions. And so we brought someone who has helped me, literally trained me. I took a course through the Davenant Institute with Timothy Jacobs, and he was super helpful. I'll link to some of the things that he does both on YouTube and his website that are helpful aids for learning some of this metaphysical stuff. And so, Tim, why don't you just introduce yourself to our audience, and also maybe give a little bit of background of why you got interested in Aristotle and Thomistic psychology.
Yeah, cool. So, my name is Tim Jacobs. I'm from California. I'm in California. Went to Cal Baptist University, met my wife there. Also went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, got 2 master's degrees from there, and went on to University of St. Thomas in Houston. Got a master's PhD there in philosophy. Wife, 3 kids. And so the reason I got into Aristotle, the reason I got into philosophy is the kinds of questions that I was asking, I didn't find in, say, theology, in terms of I always wanted to ask why, not just what. I didn't just want proof texts. I didn't want just Bible verses as the answers, because different interpretations in the end need logic to sift out. And so I went into philosophy, and it was a Christian university and everything, but also went to seminary. But the reason I got into Aristotle and then eventually Aquinas is that in both philosophy and theology, seems like the way it's usually done today is each issue seems to be disconnected. Ethics is disconnected from metaphysics. Politics is disconnected from, whatever else, from physics, all these different kinds of things, from logic. And even in theology, right? Doctrine of God seems to be a totally different topic than doctrine of the church or doctrine of end times or all that kind of stuff. So all seems to be disconnected, and you just, different buckets, and you just put different things in different buckets. But man, when you start to read old theologians and old philosophers, especially someone like Aquinas, you see that everything is connected. Everything is so connected. In fact, with just kind of a handful of principles, you can answer like an infinite number of questions. And that's kind of the thing with AI. I can't say that I've researched a bunch in AI, but I've thought a lot about Thomistic psychology, and those foundations give me the principles I need to handle tomorrow's problems that I can't even foresee. And that's really the goal.
Mm-hmm. Really good, really helpful to talk about the integration across fields, because we so like to compartmentalize. It's really interesting when you look at these government bodies and they're asking the questions on how do we respond to AI, and who do they bring into the room to sit at that table. They'll bring some of these tech CEOs, they'll bring maybe an AI ethicist. But again, that's like this defined specialty, AI ethics, and it tends, if you read them like I have, they tend to not actually be able to answer some of these bigger questions, that they kind of punt those questions away because they're like, well, there's a lot of people who disagree on this, but I guess you need to just think about how AI behaves. If it behaves like a human, then therefore, we respond to this. And I'm not going to get into a critique of some of these AI ethicists today. But we really do need to have that foundation. So I guess help us with that foundation. Like, dear listener right now who's doing the laundry or driving in their car, get ready to sit down and learn with us on what Thomistic psychology is, or like, what do we need to know as a foundation before we get into the AI question?
Yeah, that's it. That's good. Like on YouTube, I follow guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and like, I'm a sci-fi nerd, and I just like and a science kind of nerd, and uh, I like following some of these guys. But it's funny because, like you said, when they get to some of the bigger questions, they're kind of scratch. If they're honest, they're scratching their head and they don't know the answer. But they typically are overconfident and they feel like they know the answer, and they're starting to step into philosophy and they don't have a clue what they're talking about. So so Thomistic psychology, right? Who first off, like, who is Aristotle and who is Aquinas, right? Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher, 400s ish BC, and Thomas Aquinas was a seminary teacher and scholar and theologian and philosopher of the 1200s at the University of Paris, and he was key. He wasn't the first, but he was the most prominent to take Aristotelian logical tools and philosophy and use them to help make theology more systematic. Honestly, he was the first one to write a systematic theology, and he sort of, you could almost say that he formalized the field of systematic theology by using philosophy and the Bible. So, so what does he have to say about psychology? If we think about it just from like the ground up, if you were to observe just living things and all the different kinds of things that they do, and then start to categorize those kinds of things, there's basically five different categories of the kinds of things that living things do. And in philosophy or in theology, we call those five things powers or abilities or faculties. And so for all living things can do what we call the nutritive power, which is like the basic definition of life. This is growth, reproduction, and nutrition. So sometimes it's also called the vegetative power because it's the only thing that plants can do.
Because it's not just nutrients in food, it's like also nutrients in the soil or sunlight,
Right.
photosynthesis. That
And
would be
this is
like
going to look,
this power.
it's right. It's going to look so different in everything. When you're eating a hamburger and digesting it, like categorically, that's the same kind of thing as, a pumpkin plant, like sucking nutrients from the ground. So this is, nutrition.
Just material, right? There's no immaterial, non-material thing going on there.
You mean organic
Um,
versus inorganic?
Yeah, no, like it's just a description of a physical reality. Because I'm
this
thinking
is just
later on when we
physical.
get to AI, there's
Right.
going to be questions of like when it computes, it's all physical. Anyways, we'll get
Right.
there later.
So this is physical, and this is just from the ground up, right? So then everything that's alive can do those things. And that's probably where it needs to begin with AIs. Can AI truly do those things? And that takes maybe a little digging deeper into what those things are and the nature of those things. But the next step, you've got separation of plants to animals. Animals, they have senses. So the next power is just sensation. And this technically is what sentience means, sensation. And this is like our five senses, sight, touch, sound, all that kind of stuff, but also the internal processing. And this is where it starts to get more interesting because think about this. It's the information that you get from touching something is totally different. It's like a totally different language than the information you're getting from your eyes or from your ears. But once it's internal, you combine those into a single object. The apple that you see is also the apple that you touch, is also the apple that you taste. And you just know it's all the same object. So the internal processing of that data, sort of the internal program that processes that, we can label that various things. Sometimes it's called the common sense, but not to be confused with like street smarts and wisdom. Also having like an image in your head. As soon as you see something, there's like an image in your mind, in your brain, and that's a physical thing. You can see it when you're scanning somebody's brain. It has it's physically represented in the brain somehow.
So is that like memory then too? Because we can think, like I'm thinking of an apple right now. I can even kind of think about how it tastes, how it looks. I can think about the five senses, even though there's no physical apple around me.
Exactly. I mean, that's memory. Is being able to call up those images, and not just visual. It could be any of the five senses. Call up those images when they're not in front of you, and also uh, being able to estimate whether something is going to lead to pleasure or pain. So this is internal processing. Like the gazelle knows that the lion is going to like eat it, whatever, right? So it runs away, something like this. And so all that internal even like we know that dogs can dream. We know like there's this kind of stuff. And this is all physical. And as soon as you have these senses, you also have the next power is generated, which is just basic sense of pleasure and pain. And simple organisms are going to have a very simple sense of pleasure and pain. Complex organisms are going to have more complex emotions. Sometimes it's called the appetitive power or appetite or passions or just emotions. And this is where it really starts to challenge maybe some of our preconceived notions. Emotions are physical manifestations. Animals have them, and they are purely physical creatures. It also means that hypothetically, a machine could have emotions. We could eventually get to a state where we could recreate this thing. If it's a purely physical thing, then we can possibly invent something that has emotion.
So we're on this third
So
tier now.
right,
We just went through nutritive, that's the bottom, then sensitive, right. That's like the animal, like, because it has all the senses into it, including memory and some of that, like, all that kind of stuff. And then the next level we're in now is this desire, pleasure, and pain, which so it's, like the gazelle, like even I'm thinking about a tree that grows and it grows towards the sunlight. Is that, like you said, as soon as you have the sensitive power, you have the appetitive power, you have this third level. Is that right?
Yes. So plants only have the first level. When they are moving towards light, for example, they're not. It's just a purely like chemical kind of reaction. It's not. We wouldn't say that they're sensing it. There's not. It's not like they can see the sun or that warmth is something that they don't just experience, but that they sort of know that they're experiencing. They
Is that just
can't
due to
have
complexity,
the
or is that
image. They don't have, plants don't have the organs necessary to process that kind of data. Um, it's like trying to take a picture of what an apple pie smells like. This is plants not quite having the senses. And part of that is you can't have the external senses without the internal processing of those senses. In philosophy, we call them the internal senses, but it's better to think of them as processing, right? So they don't have an image in their brain. They don't have memory. They don't have the sense of a common object. But animals do, and animals have it on a very wide spectrum. Like an ant's emotions and an ant's mental images and stuff like that is going to be way different than, say, like a dolphin or an orangutan or something like this. All kinds of levels of complexity. In fact, we're going to bounce back to this probably once we get all the way up to the intellect, because of the kinds of ways that this sort of internal processing of sensory data can look like the intellect, but not quite be the intellect. But for the sake of contrast, I'll quickly go up the rest of the way, right? So like if you've got emotion, if you've got emotions, then some animals, can move themselves physically towards them, and we call this locomotive power, whatever, having muscles, things like this.
number 4?
This is number 4. And so animals have those three, and that kind of distinguishes them from plants, right? They have senses, emotions, and locomotion. The last one is what distinguishes humans from animals and from plants. And it's cumulative. So humans have all of these. Humans have all 5, right? Humans have all the things we've already said, but we also have the intellectual power. And the intellectual power can most easily just be divided into 2 things, which is thinking and willing, right? And in each of those, willing, sometimes we call that the intellectual appetite, because we want something, and so this is the universal, like everybody wants their own happiness, but how do we get there? What choices do we make, right? That's going to be the will. And the intellect is thinking. Thinking is essentially 3 different actions, right? It's understanding of concepts. It's judging whether something is true, whether a claim is true or not. And it's reasoning through something, thinking through something. So you could think of understanding of concepts as symbolized in like a word, unicorn. But at this stage, in logic, this is called the first act of the mind, understanding. If I just say the word unicorn, you know what I'm talking about, but you don't know whether I'm claiming that unicorns exist. That's the second act of the mind. Now I'm making a judgment. They exist or they don't exist. So we're kind of combining the concept of unicorn with the concept of existence. You're combining these into a claim that can be true or false. And then you can string together a bunch of claims and go from one claim to another claim. So you can start to investigate, why is that true? Well, if this is true, then this is true, then this is true. So the first act of the mind is understanding, second act is judgment, third act is reasoning. And the goal of reasoning is to get to causes, to understand causes. Aristotle says wisdom is understanding causes. And honestly, if you even just think about like maybe the knowledge you might have of like football or whatever, like what's a good play? whatever. That's because you know cause and effect, which actions are going to cause good outcomes versus bad outcomes. Knowledge is understanding causes. So maybe I'll pause there for a sec.
It's kind of funny. Like I always find this with this Thomistic psychology. Like you basically have this old stuff that Aristotle, when you read Aristotle, like at times it's just like very thick and it's hard to wrap your mind around it. And other times you're just like, well, this is so obvious. But then the obvious dots connect together into like, oh yeah, I guess that's just how it works. Like your 3 parts of the cognitive power, 3 parts of like this 5th level within thinking of understanding judgment and reason. It's like, well, that's so obvious. Like, of course. But I think it's the system, going back to what you said at the beginning, it's like that system for understanding these things so that we can now start to evaluate a claim like, does AI think? Does it have a cognitive power? And we could get into that right away. But Joel, where are you at? How are you tracking with this? Because basically we argued, well, we had a good chat. We didn't argue, but we had a good chat last week. And then I sent you Tim's video. So you've kind of seen some of this stuff and then you did some more reading. So where are you at right now?
I think, and I think this is probably why philosophy and like the meaning of words is really important, because me coming from, let's say, the tech point of view, when I say a word, it might have a different connotation than what when you say it. So and this actually, I noticed even happened with philosophers. So Rene Descartes had this whole concept of dualism, and he's talking about the mind versus the body. But now when you look at Aristotle considers the mind actually a part of the body, and the soul is what he's separating as like the second aspect. So for me, I think I was often getting caught up with people being like, well, what's the difference between a soul and a mind? Right. And it's like, then I also learned about Aristotle having souls for animals, plants, and humans, and different type of souls. So I think there is like a lot of different concepts that I kind of waded through over the last week. And it was very helpful. And to me personally, it's like, okay, I can see how there is a difference between AI and humans, but it does fit into this spectrum, right? Like for example, let's jump into thinking. One of the big changes that happened in the science of artificial intelligence, like the development, is this paper that came out in 2017 called Attention is All You Need. And it basically was a scientific paper that explains how the models that they're creating today, all these like foundational models, how they actually create these relational concepts. So like Tim was mentioning, you have an apple. You can feel an apple, you can see an apple, you can eat an apple, and then you create this superimposed concept of what an apple is. And that is actually the same process that these models are trained on, is kind of combining these different concepts. So, for example, there are ambiguous words like the term bank. Bank could be like the bank where you go get money, or the bank of a river. And how the machine actually can contextualize that is, like Tim was saying with the word unicorn. It's like, okay, there's a concept of that, but then unicorns exist actually creates the intention to be like, okay, what is the judgment here? So where can I place this term bank, right? It's like, oh, in the sentence, this is what it means, right? And it's actually making that judgment. That's how it's kind of impressive when you talk to these things like ChatGPT, because it can infer these concepts of the differences in bank by what you're asking it. So at some level, it is doing some similarity to the intellectual computation that we do. And I think, before I kind of like pass it back to get your thoughts, I think the general paradigm is that we are still in this narrow AI phase, right? But the philosophers, can't say that word for whatever reason on this call, who are thinking about superintelligence are saying, well, what happens when we can actually fully replicate the pattern of the brain? And what about like emergent consciousness and like all of these terms that I'm just throwing out? But yeah, so clearly a lot going on in my mind.
Yeah, that's cool. Let me let me see how I can respond to that. And if along the way I forget some of the stuff you said, remind me and I'll respond to it. Just a quick thing on the soul. Man, if you can even tackle that, just in like 2 minutes to map out like different theories of the soul. First off, you could just deny that it exists, whatever, pure materialism. But basically what you alluded to with like Descartes and Aristotle, whatever, historically there's like two broad camps and a bunch of different varieties within them. One is probably the one we're most familiar with because it's the most cultural nowadays, post-Enlightenment and post-Descartes, which is this dualism. This is to say you are your soul and you just happen to be in your body. It's like a house. And this can be really attractive to, say, a lot of Christians or whatever religious.
But it's wrong.
It's wrong because what it ends up meaning is that to be human is not necessarily to be essentially physical, right? It's just, it makes us almost indistinguishable from angels. And even in Descartes, he famously had a problem not being able to resolve how the body and soul are connected. But it is very like popular level cultural way to think about soul and body, because it's a shortcut way to think about the afterlife. Like if I exist after I'm dead and like my body is in the ground somewhere, oh, they must be two separate things. Well, it's not that simple. In the Aristotelian camp, think of it more like, I just came up with this analogy yesterday. It is great. Even though Aristotle and Aquinas both explicitly deny this particular metaphor for other reasons, think of like a song, right? A song is a physical thing. It's vibrations in the air, but it's not just vibrations. You can have noise without it being a song. But a song is essentially a physical thing. It's a physical manifestation. It's this thing. But you can have notation. You can think of the song in your head without like singing it out loud. You can have this sort of disconnect from the physical, right? The song in some sense still exists even if nobody is singing it. But it's essentially a physical thing. What's a song? It's a physical thing. It's this thing that you do out loud, right? You sing these words, or you have instruments, whatever. You can kind of think of that with the soul, with the human. Humans were created as physical things, physical creatures. That doesn't mean there cannot be an immaterial aspect to us, or that we cannot in some sort of like partial way exist without a body. But it does mean that to be human is to be physical, which also makes sense of the resurrection. That's why there's a resurrection. Because even though in like heaven we're perfect and we see God and all this kind of stuff, that does not mean that we are complete, right? We're perfect as sinless, but there's a resurrection still because we're to be human. Angels don't get, resurrected or whatever. So that brings us into something else, right? Into like just some like what's some boots on the ground like application. What does this stuff look like? All this mapping out of Thomistic psychology and these 5 powers, all this. Just one sec. I noticed you can edit this part out. I just noticed I'm just on battery power because my power strip is not turned on.
In your battery.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no,
okay. You're filling up your nutritive power, your vegetative power of your computer. It needs more nutrition
That's it.
for it to work.
Anyway, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, yeah, getting back into it. So these 5 powers, what does this mean? Well, these 5 different things about us as humans are not like all working independently at separate times. They're all working together because you're just one person and everything is integrated. So that means you can, for something like a thought, think of it like this. The intellect uses the physical brain as its vehicle in the same way that the song, when it's sung, uses your vocal cords or a piano, whatever, right? But you wouldn't say that the song is the piano any more than you would say the thought is whatever is happening with the brain. Now, this goes back to this difference between these internal processing of these senses, like images and memory, versus intellect, right? So intellect is something that causes humans to be able to survive death because it's sort of our immaterial aspect. But every time we're using it, when we're still joined to our body, every time we're using our intellect, it still uses the brain, just like a song will still be using an instrument when it exists as a physical thing. But that's not to say you can't sort of remember the tune even when you don't have a piano, right? So there can still be this immaterial. The analogy is going to break down eventually, right? But
Yeah, I
it
guess the
works.
thing that I'm thinking is that the material is kind of upstream from the later on recollecting the song and the immaterial, the non-physical form of the song in your head. Hey, I just used form in the proper way.
There you go.
But yeah, so you have this like, but for us, for human persons, it's almost like our immaterial soul, our non-physical soul, is upstream from our material because we control through our intellect our bodies, at least to a degree. But you get the point, right? Like there's
Yeah.
like I guess that's where the analogy maybe is breaking down, or maybe I'm not understanding it.
Well, I think maybe actually I could posit kind of my thesis and actually just use a moment to be like, can you explain where this might be breaking down? So I think, in understanding there's like the plant soul, the animal soul, and the human soul. And I think there's like 3 souls in Aristotelian philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I think artificial
within the
intelligence,
5 powers that we talked about, you can put 3 of them into human, animal, and plant, which Aristotle and Thomas call souls. That's what Joel's doing because Joel did his homework prior to this. He's just going right into the depths. So just for our listeners who's not up with Joel's heavy research prior to this pod episode, I'm just unpacking this, and we'll send a little we'll have a PDF attachment from that Tim made that unpacks some of this detail. But
let me just make a quick comment about that. We get wrapped up in that word soul maybe when we say that like plants have a soul or animals have a soul or something like that. But what they mean by soul is not what we understand. Like we're thinking of it through this post-Descartes dualism that a soul is like this human immaterial thing or whatever. They're saying this is a word they use to distinguish a living thing versus a non-living thing. So it's easier in Latin because Latin, the word is anima, from which we get the word animal. It's just an animate thing as opposed to an inanimate thing. So when we talk about animate things, there's 3 types of self-animation: plants, animals, and humans. So that's all it means when they say the 3 souls.
Right.
Okay, Joel,
good.
keep going. You're good.
So
this is helpful.
I think.
Sorry, one more little comment, and just to slap a little bit of Bible on it as well. The Bible also often calls animals as having a soul, using the same word that
Like
the
nephesh.
Old Testament used, nephesh, to refer to a human soul, and it never uses that for plants, so it's probably talking about sentient souls, sentient life forms. But yeah,
Right.
you think of it like life form. Okay, sorry for the
I've never
interruption.
used
Go
the
ahead.
phrase slap some Bible on it, but I do want to use that
There you
phrase
go.
in the future. I really like it. Thanks for slapping some Bible on it. Joel, your thesis. Here we go.
So I think as we kind of approach super intelligence, let's say if we ever do cross that barrier, there would be a fourth soul, which would be the artificial soul. And I think one of the common rebuffs is like, well, it's mechanical. But I think that is today just the substrate that we're running compute on. There isn't necessarily a reason why we can't move to an organic substrate, right? Like you look at the mind, it's electric signals moving through chemical transmission rather than silicon, which is electric signal moving through physical transmission. So it's different ways basically that the thinking happens. So today with AI, a lot of it is running on some silicon. In the future, you could have an organic substrate that runs on, and they could have sensing, and with that organic substrate comes all the nutritive aspects that we talked about in the 5 stages. And I think ultimately the main differentiator between these us and that future AI state will be our relation to God, right? I think it will be really coming down to free will. And like where angels kind of would fit on the spectrum, right? As like intellectual beings that currently don't have bodies, but AIs will be kind of in that tier, but not having free will.
And I've said to you, Joel,
That's
before
really
that I
interesting.
think. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I agree with everything that you said except for the fifth soul part. In this sense, right? Let me put it in my own words. Scientifically and technically, there might be impossibilities here, but philosophically, I think there's a lot of Elise right here. Philosophically, hypothetically, we could invent a new animal. You could hypothetically we could create like a living, breathing, I don't know, Pikachu or something like this,
Yeah.
like a Pokemon or just like some random thing. Because of like what you said, like if we get, 1,000 years from now, who knows, right? 100 years ago, nobody would have even envisioned like where we are right now. So who knows what 100 or 1,000 years from now. Hypothetically, it's possible to physically recreate the first 4 powers, and to do so in a way that is like, I hesitate to say more advanced than anything we already find in nature, because God's already pretty good at making crazy stuff. But if we can, for example, if we can have computers be doing, calculus or something for us, then we can just program that into our like unicorn that we invent, maybe, right?
Pikachu.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, or Pikachu or whatever it is. And so hypothetically, like they could look maybe even superhuman.
Yeah.
So now let's go back to
But
like
you're
what
saying
is
it's not the same level. Yeah, because of what
it's
you're
not.
about to say.
It's not. So you were the first to introduce the swear word of forms. So I want to play
Sorry.
off of that. No, form. Okay, form is like it's important for this. Form is a technical term in philosophy, and particularly in Aristotelian philosophy. Think of form as like the qualities or the shape of a thing. So like an apple is red. Red is a form. And that's also in like the pickup truck outside or like the rubber bouncy ball, right? So the redness of the apple is not possessed by the pickup truck. So the form in the apple is part of its individuality. Or even like your health versus my health. Like they're two different forms when they're in physical things. But if you think about redness, I have the same concept of redness that you do, right? Once it's abstracted from the physical thing, it becomes a universal. It's the same form existing in a different mode. Instead of existing as a physical reality, it's existing as an abstraction in the mind. Not only do we all share the same concept of red, but we know that it's a concept. But we're embodied things, and we still use the physical aspects of like memory and imaging and senses. So if I say to you and to all the listeners, it's like a little thought experiment, right? So a little workshop thing. Everybody who's listening, right? Think about tree, or think about ball, right? Pick one. Let's just stick with one, right? Let's stick with ball, all right? Think of ball, just ball. Think of ball, but try not to think of a particular ball. Try to think of it without visualizing its shape. Can you do that?
What?
Can you think of ball? Can you even think of red? Can you think of ball without visualizing? Now there is this condition called aphasia, where people do have difficulty visualizing things, but not necessarily an impossibility. So my point here is that so long as we are united to our body, we think through the vehicle of our brain, but there's still this immaterial aspect. So let's knock on the door of the immaterial within your own mind. When I say tree, what you might visualize some generic looking tree, some kind of bushy little thing, whatever you would have drawn on a piece of paper in kindergarten, right? Something like something generically oak tree or something like this, right? But then if I say, oh, but a palm tree is a tree, like you probably were not visualizing a palm tree, but you know that the concept tree also applies to a palm tree. It universally applies to this large variety of things, and you know that it universally applies. And you also know that that universal concept is not identical to the image of the oak tree that you had in your mind, right? If I say just tree, if I tell anyone to just draw a tree, very few people are going to immediately put down a palm tree or a pine tree or a willow tree. They're going to do something like an oak tree or an apple tree, nice bushy thing, right? But they know the concept tree is not confined to this particular tree. That separation of particular from universal is something that only the immaterial mind can do. Now, but so long as we're united to the body, we can't force ourselves to think without using our brain. So we should expect that every thought we have of any kind has some sort of physical component of it, so long as we're still united to the body. But that doesn't mean that it's all purely physical. Just in a similar way that a song, is meant to be physical, and it's physical. It exists as a physical thing when you're singing it, but that isn't to say that you can't just also remember it even while you're not singing it, kind of a thing. Okay, so take that and then take it to like AI, right? AI can do the same thing as animals. This internal processing of data can be super complex. It can even knock on the door of language in animals. Not quite language, because it doesn't have the infinite versatility. It's more really complex signals, and things like this. But it can include problem solving, a crow figuring out how to open a jar, or an octopus opening a jar, figuring out problem solving, things like this. And then if we can program that, certainly that can have infinite complexity, right? Problem solving in that sense. Even just saying that tree, the universal concept of tree, applies to all kinds of particular trees. If you could, just as a human, let alone forget computers, just as a human, if you could just amp up your thinking ability to be able to think of not just like a palm tree next to a pine tree, but think or hold visually in your mind the image of every tree you've ever seen. If you could do that, that's still purely physical. And then if you could take that and tag it as tree, and tag which features of those things are what make it tree, then it's still a purely physical internal calculation to judge that this new thing I've never seen before so closely matches one of these other things that it's just another tree. But that's not a universal. That's still all particular. It's just quantity upon quantity. It's just a large data set of particulars. And it can appear like a universal, but it's not, because the animal, for example, will not be aware of the thing as a universal. Of course, you could tell a parrot, repeat after me. This is a universal. You could program a computer to say, oh, I understand. But do they? Do they understand it as a universal? Now, that's, we're just talking about trees. What if we talk about something like knowledge of God, right? So whatever a thing is, whatever powers it has, it's going to be fulfilled in like the utmost version of whatever that thing is. So we have reason. So that means we're fulfilled in knowing God. That's our end. That's what fulfills us. And knowing, not just knowing about, right? Satan knows about God. The demons know about God. But if I asked you, do you know Brad Pitt? You know that that's a different question than do you know about Brad Pitt, or do you know who he is, right? Do you know God? Which means you have a relationship with him, which means you love him, and does he love you? Do you have a relationship? So we are made to love, and because we're made to love, we're essentially relational creatures. Love is not just using each other, or which is basically what animals do. Love is knowing that the other person is a person and seeking their good as a good that you share, right? So willing that they would know God and that you would together know God, right? So even evangelism comes out of it, right? So your pet dog or cat doesn't love you. It just is using a very advanced and habituated estimative power, the internal processing of the sensory data. It knows it gets pleasurable emotions from you, but it's not going to love its enemies. There's no way an animal will be able to love its enemies. And this is also where we need to separate emotion out, right? Because we tend to think emotion, like you watch a Disney movie or whatever, and the thing that makes us human is emotion. It's like, no, that's stupid. Your cat has emotion. You have more complex emotions, right? But love is not an emotion. You can be angry at your spouse or child and love them. In fact, you could be angry because you love them. You could be happy because you love them. You can have every possible emotion, different emotion, as an expression of love because you're seeking their good. You're you're frustrated that they did something bad to themselves because you want what's good for them, things like this. And so in the end, we will a test, a Turing test, ultimate Turing test for AI will be love of God and understanding that it's loving God and understanding and having the ability to, well, here's a test case, right? Straight from Jesus. No greater love has anyone than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends, right? Could an AI engage in so much understanding of the other's good as a good to be able to sacrifice itself for that end, and even for that shared end, right? Something like that. So here's the other thing. Well, maybe I ought to pause. I'm just going to start rambling like crazy here. What do you think
No,
about that, Joel? How's that go with what you're saying?
there's 2 points you made. One is the ability of universals. The other one was the love angle. Go ahead, Joel.
Yeah, no, I think there are differences between us and AI, right? And I think that's partly maybe because coming from my Christian perspective and knowing that we have something unique. But I think, like you said, oftentimes what people point to as a differentiators are emotion or intellect or these type of things, where I think that like AI will actually come much closer to us than animals we know today, but there will still be some differentiation. And I think another point of view kind of,
Yeah.
cool.
Except for one caveat, which is they will always be, they will never have, and this is a can of worms, which we don't need to go down. They will never have what we call a natural essence, which can only be created by God. They will always be a machine. Of course, if we do successfully invent a new animal, then we have invented a new essence, but it was already programmed into nature to be able to be there. Like what is the like plutonium, right? Plutonium is not found in nature. Uranium is, but we invented plutonium. But God created such a nature that it could be that, right? So it's like a new essence, a new. Anyway,
latent
I'm sorry, that's a
potentiality.
total sidetrack.
No, I think it's important because it kind of goes on to the second concept that we may not have and probably don't have time to unpack. But they're like this first part of like brain emulation, like creating this AI. And the next is like, okay, the other areas are like brain computer interface. So like connecting the human with this other, right? And I think we see a lot of that today with replacing a limb, you're still you, replacing your heart, you're still you. We can make that mechanical heart or physical arm into an organic thing at some point. We are doing like organic transplants and stuff like that. So I do think there's now this concept of like, well, it could be like, yeah, like at what point is it going to change the essence of us from being this AI other? And this is kind of the interesting area, like to
No, it's a good
theorize on.
point. So we make a Pikachu or we make an orangutan smarter. Let's take an orangutan, right? Or like whatever, any kind of primate, and you take it and you start to tamper with its DNA and program it, or forget that. You just make something purely synthetic that is the same shape, physical shape as a human, but it's purely like you just like you put it together somehow, whatever, right? You machined it and you did it out of organic material, all of the same organic material. In fact, you artificially constructed like DNA, although the machines they would use would probably be even organic machines, which we have, right? Nanites, which seem like a sci-fi thing, but we do have some, are basically genetically engineered little bio machines. So anyway, so you do this. So let's say you somewhere in the future, we make an organic machine that is the same exact shape and structure as a human. Well, you haven't actually invented, and then then you turn it on, whatever, shoot it with lightning, whatever it is that you got to do, and now it's awake and it's thinking better than you and I ever could, whatever. Let's say because DNA has been tampered with. You haven't invented anything new. You've just made a human. Like, that's all it is. It's just, that's a human. That's like the mic drop right there, right? Like that's all it, that's
just
that's
like
all it is.
processing. What is
You
that?
just made a human. It's just a human. If it can have mind, if it can understand universals, if it has the physical structure of a human or whatever, this is why it really gets into, it starts to blur the lines. What's the difference between organic AI, really advanced organic AI, and bioengineering? Like, they start to just become the same thing. In ethics textbooks, they'll be in different chapters because they're not Thomistic enough.
Mm-hmm.
But bioengineering is a whole separate category, usually, of like, should we engage in germline genetic engineering, where we tamper with the DNA of fetuses so that what grows is a super intelligent human beyond anything that we've ever seen. One thing you're never going to be able to do is categorically introduce like a new power. You're not going to be able to give, Wolverine claws or like laser eyes to like a human. But you could take what we already have and amp it up, which is probably more like a recovery of what Adam had than an invention, if you can say that.
But that's
Although it's probably not, it's not ethical
too,
to do that. I'm
Adam
just saying
had
hypothetically possible.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Pre-fall, perfectly pure DNA, completely composed by God. Adam will have had to have been what we would think of as a super genius.
Right. But we won't be able to. Anyways, this is interesting.
We'll have to have a part two.
I'm still parsing together some of these things because I thought the direction I thought some of this would go would be more around the will and our choosing of ends, and how machines can never truly have a telos. Like, they can never choose for themselves their purpose. They can only kind of, like, at least AI in its current form. But even if you give it the opportunity to choose something, they don't have that choosing ability that is unique to that fifth power. So, but I think it's interesting to think about the love thing that you said, the love of God, the universals, which are actually tied together, because God, as we speak of him, we're speaking of a universal concept, which Scripture is very clear. God has no physical stuff, like, that's very explicit through the Old Testament. It's in the commandments, like the second one. Like, there's a very important distinction about how God has to be a universal concept, just to slap some Bible on it. But yeah, anyways, my mind is slightly breaking. We will have to talk more. Tim,
we can
try to wrap us up and make sense of this.
Oh gosh.
I'll close. I'll say
the reason I didn't go. You could go down the avenue of the will, but it's just more complex. But everything in the universe has an end, but it doesn't know that it's pursuing the end, right? A dog doesn't know that it's pursuing the end, especially
universal,
the end of another being. So, like, if you are helping your spouse or your child or your friend or whatever, you're helping them with their end as an end, and understanding that it's an end and that you're moving them towards their end, that requires intellect. But it is an act of the will. right? An act of the will is always going to be involved in this. But we don't choose our own ultimate end. Like that's God. That's built into the nature of what it is to be human. We just choose our path and whether we go down the right path.
Cool.
But good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I never said we would get all the answers in this episode.
No.
I just said we need these categories, this language for thinking more concretely. And it's interesting as you get into it and you're like, oh, like actually, yeah, AI can do some of this stuff, and just admitting to that and not being bothered that it could be a super complex animal. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Tim. This has been a blast. People can take courses with you at Davenant. I assume you're still got.
That's right.
What are you teaching right now?
Yeah. Right now I'm taking a break, just doing admin stuff in the fall, but in the spring I'll be doing Jane Austen's Philosophy of Virtue, or this is like January. I may be teaching a Plato class, and then late spring I will be teaching a class comparing Aristotle and Plato.
Fun times.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah, I mean,
Cool.
that
Anybody
Ray
can take
Kurzweil book, I read was 20 hours long. So to think that we could have a conversation in one that captured everything is really just highlighting that there's a lot to get into here.
Yeah. So subscribe to What Would Jesus Tech as we explore the intersection of faith and technology, as we try to figure out how to use tech, find rest, and glorify God, as we try to figure out what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to use machines, and what can machines become. We'll keep track of it. We'll see where it goes, and maybe we'll even have weekly episodes soon. Who knows? Thank you to those who support us on Patreon. Honestly, it's always a blessing to see financial contributions, but also thanks for those who just follow us on socials and post our stuff and share and give us glory that way, which isn't a bad thing. Anyways, I need to wrap up. We're done. Goodbye.
See.